So what are Iran, Israel, and the United States up to again? The attacks by the United States of America and Israel also targeted the top figures of the Iranian regime. Ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump actually did it. He attacked Iran and is bombing it. He is bombing it with much greater force than in the past, because in the past it was more like a few bombs here and there, some damage to the nuclear program, but nothing major. There weren't many planes or bombs. At this moment, a much greater force is attacking Iran, and it seems that the goal is not only to destroy the nuclear program, but also to overthrow the regime itself. Well, what is actually true and what is just deception and propaganda? We'll try to uncover that today, so if you want to know more, keep watching. Maybe let's go back a bit into the past. We know that the United States and Israel have attacked Iran before with operations like Spinning Lion and Midnight Hammer. But that was more of a short-term thing, not that many forces were deployed there, because Israel doesn't have that many forces, and the United States simply refused to deploy a significant number of forces, so it was more about destroying Iran's air defense and delaying its nuclear program. It wasn't destroyed because uranium storage facilities and those kinds of sites were hit, which isn't a very effective way to destroy a nuclear program. If you hit a uranium storage, it's like hitting a steel warehouse, because uranium is a metal, so the uranium just scatters around, breaks into pieces, maybe melts a little in some places, I don't know, but in the end, it basically stays intact. You go there, you arrive with a truck, you bring metal detectors, radiation detectors, anti-radiation suits, you start collecting, and after a few weeks you have your pile of uranium nicely gathered again, and your nuclear program can happily continue, of course with some limitations, because maybe some centrifuges and enrichment equipment were destroyed, but you can still continue in some way. So what happened before? It was actually pretty amateurish, because they just came there to bomb. They bombed very little, caused minor damage, and actually didn't achieve much in practical terms. But what they did manage was to definitely delegitimize the regime, weaken it, and they managed to give people hope, for example, that they could theoretically overthrow it if it's so weak. Overall, the Americans and Israelis showed the people in Iran that the regime won't protect them or anything like that, that it's not a strong regime, that they could theoretically overthrow it, that all those proclamations about how the little and great Satan must be destroyed are just empty boasts, because the little and great Satan came and did whatever they wanted over Iran. So they managed to do all of this, but actually overthrowing the regime or destroying the nuclear program, that they didn't achieve. Now we're actually seeing the third major bombing, called Epic Fury, which is very American. There are 2 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, it costs millions of dollars, so it's going to be a huge operation, much bigger than anything we've seen before. And this operation will probably really aim to seriously degrade Iran's nuclear program. That's something that definitely has to happen, because with this kind of force, if it doesn't succeed, it would be a complete fiasco. So in this regard, it's good to realize that there are really a lot of forces there now, and it's very different from what we've seen in the past. Donald Trump and the Americans are also saying that it should be about overthrowing the regime itself. However, that could just be propaganda, because you can say, yeah, we're going to overthrow the regime. We want to get rid of that nasty regime that's doing bad things. But in reality, you might just be trying to cover up the fact that all you really want is to destroy the nuclear program, and you actually have no intention of overthrowing the regime, because that would be pretty foolish and would destabilize the whole region, which is probably not what you really want. But you can say that because you can talk about how the regime does bad things, how it has executed a lot of people, how they treat women there, how they commit terrorist attacks, how they support terrorist organizations. You say all this, and of course public opinion suddenly goes, yeah, let's destroy it. Let's destroy it. Then, after you bomb the nuclear facilities, you say, well, it didn't work out. We didn't manage to overthrow the regime. The regime is still there. but at least they no longer have nuclear facilities. They won't have a nuclear bomb. The regime is weakened, but unfortunately it survived. There's nothing we can do. We tried to overthrow it, but somehow it didn't work out. Maybe it'll fall gradually later. But the main thing is that now they don't have the nuclear bomb. Yeah, but before that, we'll have a lot of talk about how we mainly care about those people's freedom and how we want to ensure security and how the regime is bad, so we have to destroy it. However, this bad regime isn't completely defenseless, and at the same time, destroying it or achieving the goals that are mentioned in the propaganda could be quite complicated and pretty risky. Let's describe everything that can go wrong. We'll begin with the Strait of Hormuz. Oil will, of course, become brutally expensive because Iran will close the Strait of Hormuz, and the overall instability in this region from where a huge amount of oil comes, the Persian Gulf and all these places, causes oil prices to rise because it increases uncertainty on the world markets. That's absolutely clear. As for the price of oil, it will probably rise by about 15%. As for the current oil prices, they should increase by up to 40% because of that shock. But fortunately, it's the weekend, so the markets are closed, which means it can't have such a shocking effect right now. But if they were open, the price would probably skyrocket and then stabilize somehow. Donald Trump did it on purpose, attacking on the weekend when the markets are closed, so that the biggest chaos, the biggest shock, wouldn't show up in the markets. And by Monday, the situation will be clearer, calmer, emotions will have settled a bit, and the market will be more rational. On Monday, we'll find out that oil hasn't gone up by 40%, but maybe only by 15%. Which, of course, 15% is still quite a lot. It's a problem, of course, because gasoline will get more expensive for us, but it's also a bit of a problem from the perspective that a high oil price really suits Moscow. Yeah, because right now they're really bleeding, their budget is going down the drain. Because oil has been very cheap until now, Ural oil in particular has been very cheap, and when oil prices rise on the world markets, the price of Ural oil must inevitably rise as well. It would be strange if it didn't, but of course some form of sanction effectiveness could come into play, so the oil price might not rise as much as it could, but it will probably rise. That's unpleasant. It's unpleasant for Ukraine. It's unpleasant for us because it will give the Russian regime more money that it can invest in the war, and their bleeding budget won't bleed as much. So that's the first thing Iran is doing that it can do, and that can cause us problems. The second thing it's doing is firing missiles like crazy. They have thousands of missiles and drones. They're firing them at American bases. They're firing them at Israel. They're firing them at Americans. They're firing them at everything. So far, the damage is more or less, well, superficial. There is damage. Some places have been hit. Explosions have been reported. Smoke columns have been reported, and all these things. From American bases and their surroundings, from Israel and everywhere, but it's not extremely effective. It probably won't stop the attack. So in this regard, Iran is, of course, responding in some way, but its strength isn't sufficient. And they're also attacking places like Bahrain or Abu Dhabi and all these places, which of course also affects oil prices. But besides that, it kind of annoys the people in the area who are being attacked. It annoys them even more because right now it's Ramadan, so this attack is disrupting their Muslim holidays a bit, which is definitely unpleasant. And for this reason, by the way, I actually assumed the attack would come around the 15th or 20th of March after Ramadan, so it wouldn't upset the American allies in the area as much. That's something I thought would make some sense, that it could be connected, that it would be taken into account, but obviously not. So in this regard, I assumed that something would matter that in the end didn't matter at all. However, the fact that Iran is firing things in all directions and that it might close the Strait of Hormuz and raise oil prices, that's actually the least stupid thing that could happen. The biggest stupidity that could happen is that the United States achieves the goals they proclaim in their propaganda. Because, for example, Pahlavi from America said that the Iranian people should take control of their country and that they should fight, right? And that they should use those American attacks to take their country back. That's, of course, something that could happen. The Iranian people, if they're not already scared enough, could rise up. If they're scared, it's hard to say whether they'll rise up. It depends on what mode the Iranian people are in, especially after those protests that were suppressed. If they're scared to death, then American attacks will be seen more as interference, and they'll support the regime more because they'll be afraid. They'll be afraid of the Americans, they'll be afraid of the regime, they'll be afraid of Israel, they'll be afraid of everything. And frightened people behave irrationally. We can see it, for example, in the Czech Republic, where frightened people say that Ukraine should stop defending itself and that we shouldn't resist Russia because really ugly things can happen, right? These frightened people simply tend to be submissive and to side more with their own whipping master and so on rather than with rationality. So yeah, if they're scared, then the bombing doesn't have to mobilize them. On the contrary, it can radicalize them against America and support the regime even more. But if they're angry, if the emotion in Iranian society is more anger than fear, then of course it could lead to some kind of uprising. And an uprising would be unpleasant because Iran is of course not a completely homogeneous state. Especially in the north, there are, let's say, areas that could be separatist. Besides that, we have Iraq nearby, which, yes, at this moment has some stability, but there are still various skirmishes and militias there. We have Afghanistan here, where the Taliban is in power. Yeah? And that's not good at all. Because if what the Americans want were to happen, meaning what they say in their propaganda, that the Iranian people would take to the streets, seize weapons, maybe some military officials and the army would join their side and go against the Revolutionary Guards and they would go for it and fight each other, well, then we'd have Iran in a civil war. Iran in a civil war is an Iran where, let's say, radicalism is obviously present, which is already rooted in the very state ideology. But besides that, for example, separatism as well, right? Separatism of the Azeris, separatism of the Kurds, Armenians, and all these ethnic groups that are located in the northern parts of Iran. Well, this separatism and overall radicalism and a civil war as such would, of course, create a breeding ground for further terrorism in the United States or in the West. But what's worse, what's even worse, is that in connection with the fact that there is a lot of radioactive material and uranium enrichment facilities in Iran, and theoretically facilities where it would be possible to make even a single bomb, this destabilization of Iran could mean that terrorists and all sorts of radicals, or even the Taliban from Afghanistan, could get access to nuclear material of weapons-grade quality, which can be used in various ways. But it would be enough if they got their hands on a pile of nuclear material that could be used as a dirty bomb. So if the Americans achieved their declared goal for the Iranian people to take control of Iran, unless it happened smoothly, like the Iranian government and the imams simply fleeing to Russia and everything being fine, if it happened through some kind of civil war or a period of fighting, it would mean a huge security risk precisely for this reason, that there is radioactive material in Iran that could end up in the hands of really bad people. And for that reason as well, for that reason too, I think it's largely unlikely that the Americans would really want to provoke a civil war in Iran. Mainly, what they care about is destroying the nuclear program, and all this talk about overthrowing the regime and these things, that's just fairy tales, that's just propaganda. They only care about the nuclear issue, right? That's the main thing. Because destabilizing Iran to such an extent that people would start fighting against Iranian soldiers and the Revolutionary Guards, that's just too big of a security risk. Like, it's just too big. I don't think anyone can risk that, and not even Donald Trump could think that's a good idea. And that's saying something. So that's how it is. Of course, tomorrow it could happen that the Iranian people will celebrate, they'll welcome Pahlavi, and the theocratic dictatorship will go to hell. That could easily happen. It's just important to realize and be aware of all the risks of what could happen, of what we really wouldn't want to achieve. And it's important to realize that just because the United States started massively bombing Iran, it doesn't guarantee that the regime would fall. It's not exactly like, it's not the only thing we should want, and it's not the only thing we should be looking at. And if, of course, you're willing to risk a dirty bomb in Prague, then obviously a civil war or destabilization of Iran might be in your interest. Personally, I'm not really willing to take that risk, and therefore I don't think it's in our interest to destabilize Iran and push it into a civil war. And in another way, it seems to me highly unlikely that the regime would fall, that the regime would just disappear from one day to the next. That probability is more or less zero. So for me, let's first clarify what we want. Clarify what you want. Write in the comments what you want. And be aware that according to our Prime Minister, Iran is a threat that needs to be eliminated. And of course, we have 3 people there, but we don't plan to do anything for them. I mean, we don't plan to fly there for them or anything like that. That's the message from Makinka. So, but yes, even our government stands behind the United States. Well, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, it's hard to say which is a better excuse, right? In any case, we'll see how all of this will continue. For now, I remain highly skeptical because this reeks of a huge disaster. A bigger disaster than thousands of dead people in the streets, suppressed by the Iranian regime. This reeks of a much bigger disaster. So that's that.